making it back down from lunch so quickly. That was amazing. And I'm sorry that lunch is 4,000 miles away. Well done for making it back. Welcome to the Information Age Gallery. Those of you who haven't made it down here yet today, there's a lot more in here to distract you than the Illuminate Gallery. I went and had a look at Illuminate at lunchtime. So boring. In here, this giant thing, the thing I like about this gallery is you walk around and there's all these incredibly complicated, incredibly important pieces of technology, and none of them is as powerful as the phone in your pocket. So if you want to taunt any old computers, just wave a Samsung Galaxy at them. We are on to our third session here, and I'm going to introduce the session host, and then he's going to tell you all about what's happening, and he'll introduce the panel, and then we will get going. So this session is called The Comfort of Opinion, and our host is Rishi Bhattacharya. Rishi used to be a political journalist, but thankfully has escaped that job this year. He's now a communications consultant. I asked Rishi how's business. He said it's wonderful, but he does have space for one more extremely high-paying client from the fusion sector. So if any of you want to buy him a drink afterwards, get his rate card, he has got space for one more client. So those of you who've not been on this stage yet need to know I'm a stand-up comedian, which is why I say things like the thing I just said. But it also means that when I introduce acts onto this stage, I expect you to clap like a comedy audience for them coming up. And if you don't make enough noise, if I can't hear you clapping over the air conditioning, then I stop the whole event and I make you do it again, and that's the day. So I want you to bear that in mind as I introduce Rishi up onto the stage. So lovely people, would you please put your hands together and make a wall of noise for Rishi Bhattacharya. Good luck with the client.
Steve, thank you very much for that introduction. And just when you thought that you couldn't take any more of Rishi on stage, you've got another one. I'm the original one. I'm a little bit older, but anyway. Welcome to this session on communications and fusion. It's, from what we understand, the first time that this kind of panel is being convened. So kudos to FUSION24 for organizing it. And it's really important because fusion is at such an important juncture from lots of different perspectives, which we'll cover today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panel, and it's a cracking panel. So first of all, I'd like to introduce onto stage Kelly Lee. Kelly, if you'd like to come up. So Kelly leads comms for STEP, the UK's prototype fusion energy plant. We've heard quite a lot about STEP already so far today. And Kelly was part of the team that announced a JET fusion energy record in 2021. So a round of applause for Kelly. Okay, the next person up is Jennifer Powers. So Jennifer is ex-Downing Street. She was a special advisor on energy, business and regulation to Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Okay, next up is Zion Light. So Zion is a science communicator and focuses on environmental advocacy. She's the founder of Emergency Reactor, which focuses on education solutions for climate change, especially clean energy, and is an ex-spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion. Zion. And last but not least, Matt Walker, founder of Fact and Story, a comms agency. Matt, if you'd like to come up on stage, Matt is ex-New Scientist and ex-BBC and has been BAFTA nominated. And he told me this morning, studied zoology, which he said wasn't important or, no, relevant, yes. But it probably is somehow. We'll find a relevance for it today. But anyway, welcome to the panel. Okay, so as we move from like science-led comms, and with your background, Matt, as formerly working at New Scientist, and we move to more commercial, community-led comms, I know that you have been looking at a couple of films just as a setup to this session.
Yeah, so I just wanted to begin really and speak slightly less about fusion itself as a technology and more about the principles about communication, about how fusion can communicate with people and its perception. And there's sort of three key points I just wanted to sort of land to try and set the stage slightly. So the first one is about audiences. When we talk about communicating about Fusion, we often get very caught up in what we want to say and the facts that we want to share. And one of the key things to try and remember is it's actually not really ever about the person saying a message and what they want to say. It's really about the audience. And it's about what the audience hears. So the first thing I wanted to say was we should always be considering audiences. And audiences will be different. So when we talk about the public, there is really no such thing as the public. It's a kind of a shorthand for everybody. So we should be trying to think about specific audiences, what they're specifically interested in, and the types of information or story or communication they would want to hear. So for example, across the sort of life cycle of the technology or the industry, there will be different stories you can tell at different points to different audiences. And so it may be that you tell a story to funders and it's a different story because they're interested in the return on investment than it may be to somebody who lives downstream from where a plant's going to be built. They may be interested in the benefits or the risks. So the first point really is just think, let's remember audiences. The second is that when we communicate, particularly in kind of factually dense spaces like technology and fusion, our natural tendency is to always communicate facts, is to say lots of facts, 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 facts. We have lots of facts about what we do, and we expect people to listen. Communicating facts is actually a really poor way to communicate. They don't resonate with people that often, they're not particularly memorable, and they don't tend to impact people. What does is stories and narratives. And they tend to do that because they're often both personal and they engage people emotionally. So again, when we're communicating, it's really useful to think about the stories and the narratives we can tell about fusion technology. They may change again over the life cycle of the industry, but to remember that rather than just thinking we're sort of dispensing facts at people. And then the third point is, when we then get to what stories do we tell, is to think about the perspective from which you can tell a story from. We always tend to think of our own perspective as the storyteller, which is going to tell the story out. And often it's really beneficial to think about other perspectives you can tell stories from. So just to that point, we have a very short film, it's about 90 seconds. It has 2 examples of the same film told in 2 ways about fusion. Don't worry too much about the factual detail in there. We may comment on that later. That's an opportunity for us to talk about some of the weaknesses around communications. But just have a look at the 2 films and you'll see 2 different ways that you can tell the same story from 2 different perspectives. And I'll quickly do a quick conclusion after that before handing back to Rishi. So can we play that video now, please? Thank you. So hopefully you've noticed a difference between those 2 films. The first one, I think, is the way we would naturally tend to try and communicate, particularly about technology like this, which is there's lots of amazing things it can do. There's lots of amazing facts. Here, you should know about them. And then we presume we're going to get a reaction and a good response. I would argue often it's difficult to know who the audience would be for that first film, and also what we'd then expect of them. The second film is told from the perspective really of the end user, of someone who would benefit from that technology. And it's obviously a bit cliched, but you can see that it has much more of an emotional impact, and you can see that it's talking about the benefits of technology to a real person, and I would argue it's possibly a bit more impactful and aspirational in doing so. So anyway, that's just a quick overview to kind of help maybe set the scene for some of the later discussions, but I thought hopefully useful.
And Matt, thanks very much for that. What extent do you think individuals need to understand the science before they can accept a new technology?
As a really broad brush statement, I would actually say very little. I think what people need to understand is the benefits to them and the risks to them. So what it means to them as an individual personally. The actual technical detail about how things happen are often very secondary. And I think, again, if we look back at all sorts of other industries, for example, vaccination with COVID, people aren't really having conversations about how does mitochondrial RNA vaccines work, and how do vectors work, and what's the intracellular biology like. People having conversations about what's the benefit to me and what's the risk to me and society. So I think there's a real risk we can get too caught up in the detail and the facts and not step back and think about people, basically.
I love that. A former journalist saying, don't get caught up on the facts, yeah. Matt. Terrible. But I understand the general point. So I'm now going to turn to Kelly, because one of the themes that we want to explore in today's discussion is around the importance of community engagement, the importance of engaging with the public. We heard some of it actually in the earlier session, if you're in here, talking about regulation. Kelly, obviously with the STEP program in West Burton, you know, the rubber is now starting to hit the road, to use the expression. What have you learned so far from the community engagement that you've been doing as part of STEP?
Well, firstly, just to say where STEP and West Burton, West Burton site is located, it's in Nottinghamshire. Our community actually bridges the River Trent, because we have Retford as our closest town, but also Gainsborough in Lincolnshire. And one of the things that we've done on STEP is to actually, at a governance level, is to form a strategic collaboration group that brings together all of our local authority partners. So there's really support that spans the boundaries in that area, and cross-party support for the programme too. In terms of then how the community have responded to us, well, it's important to remember that it was in fact the site that was self-nominated to become the home for STEP. And there's a very strong residents association that formed right from the outset for that. And in terms of our approach at all of the community events that we've held, we're very much all about being straight, transparent and open. We don't try to overclaim, we don't try to say, to draw upon some of the content of that latter film, which I absolutely appreciate is the stronger one that links to a sort of personal touch. But we're not at the stage of Fusion at this moment in time where we can start promising affordable energy bills and paying those bills from Fusion. What we do need to do is talk about how it can impact people on the ground now. And I think that's what we're really doing a good job at STEP, is talking about the benefits that it's going to bring to the local community, using STEP as a catalyst for regional growth, and the legacy that STEP will leave behind it long beyond the prototype power plant, but when there's an industry there that's delivering fusion and providing long-term aspirational jobs, that people know that their children will have opportunity in that area.
And how about this delicate balance that kind of Matt teed up about risk and benefit?
So we're not risk adverse as a programme. We are a first-of-a-kind prototype fusion power plant, but we do know that fusion is safe. We stay away from words such as nuclear. We talk about fusion energy, and that's not to say that we can't learn from the fusion community. Indeed, we can. We went to Hinkley Point C just a couple of weeks ago, and there's lots we can learn from that programme. But we have to differentiate between fusion and fission, and we talk about the regulation and the different ways in which fusion will be regulated compared to fission, and why there isn't any sort of negative connotation with fusion energy that can sometimes be associated with traditional nuclear.
Zion, perhaps I can bring you in here on the fission point, and what you've observed from your work, and maybe lessons that can be learned.
So I quite like the word nuclear. I think nuclear is having a nice comeback at the moment. But when I first got involved in this work years ago, it had much more negative connotations. That's changed a lot, many different reasons that I won't go into now. One of them was the energy crisis that made a lot of people think about energy for the first time and start putting the idea of these risks and safety fears in context. So I think it's about more than just whether there's benefit or risk. I mean, everything has an element of risk. Nothing is 100% risk-free. Nothing is completely safe. Some of it is about that, that how much does it personally affect me? So that energy crisis really made a lot of people think, well, actually, it does impact me now because I'm worried about blackouts or my electricity bills are really high. And it made a lot of people revisit something that's previously been a very dirty word. Nuclear has been a very dirty word previously. And that's changing. Not everywhere. There's still some countries that are having problems with it, but public perception, even in countries like Germany, where they've shut down all their nuclear reactors, public perception is really heavily in favour of nuclear now. So it's really it's shifted away from where it used to be. And one of the things that I used to say when I first got involved, when it was a much more negative space to be involved in, and people would call me a shill for speaking in favour of fission and things like that, which just to put on record, I don't work for the industry and never have. One of the things that I found really interesting was that there's this over focus on safety. And as I say, nothing is truly 100% safe. And why do people think safety when you talk about nuclear power and waste when you talk about nuclear power, but they don't think that when you talk about coal, which frankly, the waste isn't managed, it's stored in the Earth's atmosphere as we speak, it's driving climate change, it causes many different health problems. I'm sure I'm speaking to people who already understand all of this. But you don't talk about safety and you don't think about waste. That came from activists, actually, a group that I have been involved in for a long time. I came from a background of environmentalism with environmental groups doing a lot of action and influential things years ago. And we were the people that came up with the terminology and the framing, and that's really important that we think about the framing. And I know we're touching on this already, but I think it's so important, if you can, to get ahead of the curve with the framing. And I think this is what you're trying to do here with fusion. And it's so essential, because once the damage is done, I mean, I've spent years firefighting. That's how I describe it, putting out fires about myths and misconceptions and fears that people have, where it's difficult to then discuss those things with people without getting into the science. But as you say, that doesn't really convince people. But then if you're talking about waste or reactors, you end up having to talk about the science. And actually, it's much better to come at that with a fresh perspective, look at what the benefits are, what the value is to people, but also where the mistakes have been made in the past and what kind of terminology to maybe avoid and what to stake a claim in.
I suppose one of the areas as well to explore today is fusion's at a certain particular point, as we all know in the room, but when it comes to other technologies and how other technologies have fared, and in terms of framing the narrative, in terms of getting the message across, in terms of engaging with the public. And Jennifer, maybe I could turn to you now with your insights about an experience in other energy technologies and how they've fared.
Yeah, thanks, Rishi. Yeah, I do have quite wide cross-energy sector experience. I'm working in hydrogen at the moment, but in another life, I worked in shale gas, and that was quite a life-changing experience in terms of understanding how a technology, regardless of what one thinks of it or whether it was a good thing to go ahead with in the UK, but how its fate can be decided by actors outside the industry. And I would say those actors were threefold. It was the activist class who attacked it as unsafe, even though it's doing really well in America, and there haven't been safety issues there, and of course it's been the fuel for America's economic recovery in many ways, and insulated America from the energy price shocks that came out of the Ukraine war. So there was the activist class, who in many ways were the useful idiots of the second category, which was foreign powers. There was a lot of Russian funding of the environmental movement, still is, which seeks to undermine energy security and therefore national security. And third, I would say, was government, because government took the view, and takes the view that it's up to industry to make the case. And industry absolutely has to be involved, and industry has to play a leadership role, and industry needs to take the public with it, and it needs to put its money behind those efforts, absolutely. But industry can't do it on its own. It needs to be a collective effort. And the government, in my view, regardless of party, needs to understand how important energy is for national security and for our collective prosperity, not just as any nation, but as humankind. And therefore, innovation and progress and things like fusion are absolutely integral to that security, that prosperity across the world. So I think my analysis is the government needs to take a much more front-footed approach. It needs to make the case. And I think I'd actually go even wider and say, this is, whether fusion is going to work or not is almost a secondary question. Whether it's going to happen first in Vancouver or Oxfordshire, which company is going to be involved, who's going to invest in it. Those are all really interesting, fascinating questions, but they're second-order questions. I think the bigger question, the fight for the narrative, the fight for the frame of what's happening is energy abundance, clean energy abundance, or are we going to have a world of scarcity? And that is the choice that we face. And I think it would be naive to think that the industry can fight a battle that is simply about our technology will work without understanding the broader context in which that argument is being fought, which is between abundance and scarcity. I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Jennifer. And Matt, if I could just bring you in here about, and maybe the rest of the panel as well, just about, I suppose as all of us involved in communications in some form of another, there's the fight maybe for the narrative, there's the shaping of the narrative, but there's also an acceptance, I think, in this day and age that you can't control everything.
Yeah, it's true. And a lot of it comes down to the kind of psychology of communications to some degree, because something I was reminded of as fellow panelists were speaking is there's this kind of known phenomena that if you tell someone something negative, so if you say to someone, I'm going to take £5 away from you, the reaction to that is twice as strong as if you say, I'm going to give you £5. And I think Daniel Finkelstein and people talk about this with like elections and politics. And I think that possibly also helps, at least explains some of the fight that's on our hands. So when people skew back to talk about risk, it's partly because hearing that message of there's a risk lands twice as strongly with them as hearing a message of benefit. So there's a natural psychological phenomenon that kind of goes on that means we're swimming against the tide slightly. But also bringing it back to narratives, and on the other side, which is really useful, is stories and narratives are far more convincing than facts. There's quite a lot of research that shows that they actually stop people arguing with you. If you share facts with somebody, they will argue with you on the facts. If you tell them a story, it sort of naturally and almost psychologically comes around that and engages them. They tend to go with you with your story. So I know that's not a direct answer, but there's some of those hints around how the psychology of communications works that I think is really useful for us to be aware of and hopefully utilise going forward.
Go on, Kelly.
So I think the narrative, it's different levels though, isn't it? It's the bigger picture narrative with climate change and energy security, which you're talking about, but then there's also the narrative for the people on the ground, which is how can I get involved with STEP, for example? Well, how can I get a job? And it's what it means to them. So absolutely agree, it's those different narratives.
Yeah, and a lot of that comes back to who are you talking to and what does it mean for them in that moment? And that's often an emotional response that you get. And you found this a lot, haven't you, when you've been going out talking to people who might be directly impacted. It's an emotional conversation you're having as much as a factual one.
And I suppose with STEP, Kelly, that there's immediate benefit. So there's more immediate benefit in terms of potential, jobs and skills and all of those things in that part of Nottinghamshire, which would be well received.
Absolutely, and our strategic collaboration group partners are working on that right now in terms of the regional vision and the social and economic impact for that. So that's something that we'll see in due course.
And Zion, I just wanted to ask you as well about, and I know that you're in the space, but not necessarily in fusion per se, but, what advice would you give about steering this, fine line and not attracting the attentions of too many activists?
Well, I don't think you can avoid the activists. I think that you will get them with any technology. I saw a TikTok video that went viral recently where someone was saying that glasses are a fad and you don't need them. You can train your eyes and fix your eyes, and it's all about big glass. I'm not even joking. This was a real video. I had to look into it because I was like, surely this is parody. But I think it shows no technology is safe. And glasses are a technology, right? We tend to, when we talk about technology, we're talking about fusion or fission. Everything is technology. Our shoes are technology. The stage we walked on is technology. The chair that allows me to sit is technology. Toothbrush extension of myself. All of these things are technology. So some things maybe escape. Glasses have broadly escaped, but there is apparently a movement of people who believe that you can fix your eyes, and it's a problem to wear glasses. And then there are bigger issues when it comes to the activists who. So in that case, you all laughed, right? So that's not a convincing story. Going back to stories, but actually the stories that were told about fission were really convincing, and they were scary. They were memorable, and I remember being scared. Learning about. Being told things about Fukushima or Chernobyl, which were not necessarily what happened there, but the way that I was told, and millions of people died, and all of these things some things that weren't even true, by really big groups like Greenpeace, who I trusted. I was quite young, I believed them. I went ahead and protested this technology. And it took me years to come around and change my mind, and it wasn't facts that did it. I went away and looked at the facts, but it was actually people having conversations with me. And it ultimately does come down to what Jennifer said about the story is, do you want scarcity or do you want abundance? This was a really important thing for me because my parents left rural area in rural India in the Punjab where they lived in scarcity. They don't have access to electricity there, and this is true for millions of Indians, right? So they left behind this space, and I was in these groups protesting this technology, and my parents took me over to the Punjab, this little village 4 hours from the nearest airport, and it really drove home to me that energy is life, like energy is growth. Energy, these people are desperate. This is why my parents were young, offered the opportunity to come to a country where they couldn't speak the language and didn't know where it was on a map, and they took that opportunity. And if you know anything about Indian culture, really important to be with your family, and they gave all that up. And I never understood that until they took me there when I was 19, and I saw for myself that you can have all the developments in the world. You can have vaccines, and you can have life-saving technologies and snake anti-venom, but in these villages, they can't get them. And I'd hear scare stories about someone that got bit by a snake and what happened to them in detail. Millions of people die of snake bites in India. And the problem is they have no access. And they have no access because they don't have that development. They don't have that development. They don't have access to electricity. There is no way around this. There's no Amazon going to drop a drone at your doorstep with snake venom. You will just die. And that's why these people desperately need this growth. And what I realized in these movements was they're typically really anti-growth. It's now got a name. It's called degrowth. And this is actually a really popular movement, ironically, amongst people who have all the benefits of growth and abundant, reliable energy and don't have to suffer blackouts, right? So for me, contrasting those, I came back and I started having these conversations in these circles. But it is very hard to get past those fears when they just say, I completely hear what you're saying, but I'm really afraid of this technology, so I don't think anyone should have it. And I would say, how dare you, actually. And so, yeah, so I used a lot of personal narrative and storytelling in convincing people, and it did work, even with some really entrenched views, I would say. But it takes a long time. It's never that one conversation. It's never just, we've had this debate and they're going to go away and change their mind. And that was true for me as well. So slightly off your point, but you know, I don't think there's any sailing around going, if we do this quietly, and I think nuclear industry made this mistake, we'll just be really quiet, we'll just be really careful, no one will have a bad image of us, we won't do anything. And I had this when I came into fission, and I staged a protest outside, a rally outside Sizewell to say, we want a reactor here, took Mark Linus down there, we got in the water and swam around to show that it was safe. And the industry contacted me and said, we don't want you to do this. You could get really bad press. I said, what's going to happen? Antis could turn up. That's all right, we'll offer them a Coke, you know, we'll sit down with them, have a chat. And I realized then, you know, this kind of laying low, all that's happened is the public perception of you comes from The Simpsons. Yeah. They think you're Mr. Burns because you haven't got ahead of that and put yourself out there. So it's super important, actually, to not try and avoid backlash to any new technology. So
it's super important to engage early and engage in the right way. And indeed, for us now, panel, to engage with the audience. So I wondered whether there were any questions from the audience. Yes, there's a question here at the front.
Hello, Ella Ashdown from the Nuclear Industry Association. So just going on from what you were saying, how do you personally, each of you, keep from screaming or smacking your head against the wall when you hear about all the ease of access to misinformation in this sort of social media day and age, but also trends like, I can't remember what you called it, degrowth, where people are sort of romantic about this kind of like life without, and yet the reason we're trying to do this is to help those without access. How do you personally temper that and then channel it through your jobs? Thanks.
Well, I got a job at number 10 so that I could focus more on energy security. I mean, that's a really transactional answer. It didn't last long because I was telling my colleague that I was sacked by Liz Truss, which at the time was very upsetting, but I now wear as a badge of honor. She didn't want anyone competent in the administration, and I had to go. But I'm not just being facetious. I mean, I do think you have to step up, and we all step up in our own ways. You know, we're in the communications industry, and we have clients, and we help them tell their story well, or we write books, or we do community engagement. You know, in my case, work in the energy industry, but also, you know, very active in the political and public policy space. And I actually think, going back to audiences and going back to your point around you need to get in early, there's two issues there. Once you have the activists turning up and you have the criticism, it is so much more difficult to change people's opinion. So we need to come together and make the positive case well ahead of that. I'm a bit skeptical, almost pessimistic that will happen. So I'm here to say, come on, please. But secondly, government as an audience, you know, fusion's not really on the map with the political classes.
Did fusion ever cross your desk when you were at number 10?
Never. But then there would have been people in the energy department who obviously knew about it and understood. But right. In the center, it's things that are of huge impact or incredibly urgent, or usually both. And fusion was neither. So it didn't come across my desk. But I just think there is a lack of understanding about the benefits it will bring, and they need to be drawn in and understand, and they also need to understand, and this is a very difficult argument to win, how strong the faction will be against solutions. Because there is a huge strain of thinking that is against technical progress and is against solving issues like climate change and is actually against human flourishing. And until we recognize that and really take on board what that means for how we need to respond in whatever way we choose to step up, then I think we're in danger of being unsuccessful and not realizing the immense potential that fusion has for, to your point, prosperity on almost an unimaginable scale.
Zion, I know you wanted to come in briefly because I wanted to take another question. But
so two answers. So the first, so you said, how do you deal with it and not bang your head against the wall? I used to be one of those people. And I think to have real conversations with people and to get past the kind of frustration, you have to have empathy with people. And if we're really honest, we all have some views somewhere tucked away that are not, you know, scientifically sound. A lot of people I speak to have a lot of different views, and we have to be accepting of that. And I think it's important to understand where these people are coming from. And yes, I was one of them, but we were really well-intentioned. The people in those groups are really well-intentioned. No one is trying to cause, you know, same with things like people who protest vaccines. They are driven by fear. And actually, my main answer to your question is, that is a failure of us. I think it's really easy to point and say, you know, I'm angry you fell for misinformation. Most people aren't very science literate. If the science literate people aren't getting the message across and convincing people, then that's a failure of us. We didn't have those conversations, and then we're angry that they went and protested that thing. I don't think that's true. I'm a very science literate person now, but I very rarely encountered anything when I was growing up about nuclear. All I heard was bad stuff. So, you know, could it have been different? Would I have even gotten a different job and gone and been a nuclear engineer if I'd heard different things? Probably, yes. So that is a social failure, and it especially lands on those of us that have the power and the voice to be able to help shift and shape the narrative.
Okay, I'd like to take a question from the gentleman with the blue shirt next, please. And then the lady in the pink top. I think it's pink just in front.
Kelly, please forgive me. I work for UKAEA's robotics team, and we have a robotics team because inside a fusion machine, things get radioactive. And I sometimes worry that when we say it's not nuclear and it's safe, that people will then feel disillusioned when they discover that the truth of the matter is a little bit more nuanced than that there is waste and there is radioactivity. Would the panel advise that we are open with that in our communication?
Can I answer my colleague first?
Yeah, please answer your colleague. Yeah, go ahead, Kelly.
Thank you, Nick, for the question. And at our STEP community events, we don't deny that there isn't any radioactive element to fusion in terms of the waste. We are open and transparent with that, but there is still work to do on the messaging around waste in fusion, which we're working at with wider UKAEA, but we don't deny that there isn't waste associated, so we don't want to be in a situation where we're seen to be pulling the wool over people's eyes. We're really not doing that. And to use, you know, robotics, the maintenance of a power plant, that's a significant area to manage that as well in terms of people's access to the plant and so on. And we are working on the comms around that. But what we would really like to make clear also around that is just trying to translate what things like low-level, intermediate-level, high-level waste means. There's no high-level waste with fusion, that's factually correct. We're regulated differently, that's factually correct. We're regulated differently because there are not the same risks. And so we use these messages to help differentiate between fission and fusion, but there's still work to be done on the actual messaging around waste.
And that, I guess, gets to the core of what or some of the core of what we'll be discussing today about this balance between benefit and risk, which I think is really important. So another question, please, just in front. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sarah Wilkin. I'm founder of Fly Green Alliance. On Thursday, I'll be at the World Nuclear Association discussing aviation as an end user. So, of course, that's kind of a topic where it can be a comms point. But then I was also at a Future Flights event yesterday where they were talking about government as a procurer. So Jennifer, you were mentioning the kind of role of government. Now I know in aviation that the net zero plans do include nuclear, and so that's what I'll be discussing on Thursday. But what I also heard was that actually nuclear can't go ahead without the government as an insurer. Now, Now, I've just kind of heard this along the grapevine and things like that. Is that the case? Can the case for kind of specific sectors be really strong in communication? And for sure, I will be promoting aviation has that role.
Would anyone, Jennifer, would you like to have a pop at this?
Does nuclear have to be insured by government?
Yes, currently that's the case. I mean, it does need government backing, and Hinkley see is an example of that. There's obviously a move with SMRs and modular reactors and AMRs to get to a point where, so the industry hopes, so I understand, again, I've also never worked in nuclear, that will be able to be financed by the private sector. But even in that case, and even if we were to get to that point also with fusion, you would still need wide and deep government political class buy-in because of the public perception issues, because of the safety issues, because of the regulatory structures. So you're still, yes, finance may, hopefully in time, not be necessary to come from the public purse for a lot of these technologies, but they are now, and they'll remain so for some time, I would guess.
Just very quickly, a final question to the panel. Brief answers, please. I know we're in the middle of an election campaign. You all know I'm a former political journalist, so I can't help myself. But Matt, from your perspective, and then we'll go along the panel, for whatever government comes next, what do you think the important thing is from a fusion perspective?
One thing I think I'd like to quickly touch on is this idea about kind of misinformation and the idea that we educate people. I think possibly that's a bit of a red herring. It's a bit of a sort of top-down, like, you don't know something, you're a bit stupid. If we just tell you enough, you'll get it, and everything's fine. When people don't get stuff, or they have different belief systems or form sort of activist elements, it's because of some other reason. It's because some other thing that's going on in their life that choosing to believe this other narrative then suits. And it kind of explains Trump, and Trump's winning the battle of narratives, not a battle of facts. But all the people who vote for Trump, they aren't all stupid. They're just people that need something to attach to. So bring it right back to government elections, fusion, go back to being honest, transparent, talk about how it really means to people, and just be aware that if people don't buy into your message, it's possibly for some other reason than they just happen to disagree with some technical fact you're giving them. There's an underlying belief system that you have to deal with to overcome.
Okay, Zion?
Yeah, pretty much what we've all said. I think the comms needs to be really clever to keep ahead of this, and they need to learn lessons from what's happened with fission, but not just fission, much more broadly. ULEZ, LTNs, vaccines, pretty much every technology, right, has had, every major technology, especially the life-saving ones, have had a lot of protests against them. I would even go and engage with those communities now. I don't know if anyone's doing that. What do you think about fusion? Why don't you like it? Let's get ahead of that right now. These are the sort of things I'd be encouraging people to do.
Okay, Jennifer?
Yeah, I would just say from an audience perspective, that needs to happen with the political classes as well. It's difficult for them because obviously they're thinking in 5-year horizons, and this is something that's going to benefit the country and the world in 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So that's a more difficult sell. But there's things that can be done practically now. You can be educating the new members of parliament when they get elected in 3 weeks' time. You can be working with the future system operator, which is the body that's being set up, the public body being set up to actually plan our energy system in future, and get into the business of co-locating new baseload with industry, and what does that look like? And I think more broadly, selling the concept of abundance and prosperity at that higher level to complement the work that Kelly and her team are doing on a more regional basis.
Kelly, last but not least.
As you know, I work for an arm's length body, so I can't answer that fully. But what I will just say is that on the ground we have cross-party support with our stakeholders around West Burton site. And to use your line that you gave me before the session, if I may, that fusion is bigger than politics.
Okay, well, on that note of the pre-coaching that went on before this session, thank you very much to the panel. Give them a round of applause, please.